Now, the way to answer this question, and here I want to affirm this, that we are not going to answer these questions merely by philosophical speculation. We must answer these questions biblically, okay? We use the material that the Bible itself has provided. And here is what we will find. How do you define sin? How do you define sin? Is God the author of evil? Sin? That's the question. Now I'm asking another question. How do you define evil? How do you define sin? What is sin?
Sin is the transgression of God's law.
Okay, so sin is the transgression of God's law. I'm glad you said God's law, not just law. So who puts down that law? God. So you cannot define sin apart from God's law. I think you find that in 1 John 3 and verse 4. And because sin is a transgression against God's law, sin is therefore an affront to the holiness of God. It is a provocation of God to anger. 1 Kings 17 verse 1. Sin is anything other than that which is right. 1 John 5, 17. So what we mean by all this is whenever sin is committed, who is the aggrieved party? Who is offended? God, isn't it? Yeah. Whenever sin happens, God is the aggrieved party. He is the offended party. So here's what we then say. If God is the being that he has revealed himself to be in the Bible, God cannot be the author of his own offense. Okay? Yeah. So however you look at this, you cannot accuse God of offending himself. Yeah. Without denying that he is God. Or that he's acting in ways that are irrational. Yeah. You can't accuse God of irrationality. Now, we might not understand a lot of things about how sin comes about, but in our limited understanding, we must be careful not to accuse God of being irrational. Because to then accuse God of being the author of his own offense would be to accuse him of being irrational. So that's the first way in which we respond to that accusation. So, the other way to argue it is to say that whereas Scripture actually does teach that God ordains and directs all things that happen, including sin, and uses them for his own holy ends, nowhere in the Bible, not a single place in the Bible, not one, are we ever told that God delights in sin. You don't see anything like that in the Bible. God never delights in sin. That also the Bible teaches. Thirdly, there is not a single place where God is accused or blamed for being the author of sin or evil. Whenever sin happens, in the Bible, responsibility is always laid squarely at whose feet? The sinner, isn't it? Yeah. Even where God actually works through that sin to bring good ends, the responsibility for sin is always laid at the feet of the sinner. Now, two texts I'll talk about here. In James chapter 1 from verse 13, it describes the whole ecosystem of how sin comes about. James 1 and verse 12. Especially verse 13. Verse 13 says, Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. The point is, God is never actively involved in the production of sin. Okay? He's never actively involved in the production of sin. So when someone is tempted, please don't blame God for that temptation. Okay? Because God never tempts anyone to sin. God himself can never be tempted by sin. And then now, in verse 15, we are going to be told how sin comes about. So how does sin come about? Sin comes about when each person is tempted, when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. You see the origin of sin? Our own desire. So God never solicits us to sin. God never pushes anybody to sin. God never tempts anyone to sin. When sin happens, it is because our own desires. Now, let's look at the first sin when it happened in Genesis 3. The conversation between the woman and the serpent. God says what he says. The woman says what, no, the devil says what he says. And then when the sin happens, look at where responsibility is placed. Before the woman eats, stretches her hands to pick the fruit, we are told, and the woman saw. And the woman saw that the fruit was good for food, was desirable to make one wise, and was pleasant to the eyes. So these are determinations going on in our own mind, in our own heart. Again, you see, Scripture is careful to lay the blame squarely on her doorstep. That's what we find here in James, that each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then the desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. That's how sin comes about. So the way the Bible describes the emergence of sin in revealed truth is such that God is nowhere made responsible for it. That's what God has revealed. Yeah. Man and man alone is responsible for his own sin. Now let's look at another passage in Genesis chapter 50. Genesis chapter 50. Now this again is the episode of Joseph and his brothers. They've sold him, he's now rescued them, their father has now died, and they are afraid, they are apprehensive that upon their father's death, Joseph will revisit the evil committed against him, and he will now finally revenge. Maybe he didn't revenge because he was respectful of our father. Now that Mzee Hayuko, he'll now exact his revenge. And so these brothers are afraid. And they come to him in chapter 50, verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. So they sent a message to Joseph and said, your father gave this command before he died. Now, we're not told anywhere that his father made this command. But they now want to blackmail Joseph. Yeah, because now the father cannot come up and deny it. Yeah. Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Okay? So their language really smells of blackmailing. Yeah. They're trying to manipulate you. Yeah, so the servants of the God of your father. Do it because of your father's sake. But they're very fearful. Joseph will exact his revenge. So Joseph wept when they spoke to him like that. Because he harbors no ill will toward them. So his brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, do not fear, For am I in the place of God? Am I in the place of God? And then he says in verse 20, as for you, you meant evil against me. Right? But God meant it for good. To bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So here it is. One event is taking place. Okay? There are two people behind it. Right? One is the people who are committing those atrocities, his brother. And they have evil intent. And the other person standing behind this is God. And in the eyes of God, this is part of a grand plan, isn't it? To do something good. So look at the intentions, look at the purposes, look at the objective. Insofar as the human beings committing these things are concerned, they have evil intent, don't they? They have evil intent. But God, in the same act, has holy intent. You see how the holiness of God is maintained. And the evil of the man is maintained. Okay? Yeah. For lack of a better example, let me just let me put it this way. So I'm a parent, okay? And I have children, and I'm going to inflict pain on them in order to make them better. Right? That's all. So, from that perspective alone, is the pain I'm inflicting on them evil? No. In a sense, it is sanctified by the intent. From the perspective of the intent, it's part of a good plan. Now, someone else inflicts pain on my child because they are jealous either of me or of my children, and the intention is to destroy that child. You see, there's a difference there. So what I'm doing is right and good because it is sanctified by my good intention. What they're doing is evil because it is rendered so by the evil intent. So that, from that perspective again, you see, one event taking place, two people behind the same event, one for entirely holy ends, the other one for entirely evil ends. That's what we find here. So again, responsibility for evil, in the sense that evil is never placed at the doorstep of God. It's always placed at the doorstep of the one who does that evil. And so if we are thinking biblically, we can't accuse God of being the author of evil, because Scripture prohibits it. Okay? Now, later on, we will discuss the matter of the decree of God, I think in a later unit. And we will discuss the decree of God, and we'll say that the decree of God means that God ordains all that happen in the universe. And then we'll discuss the matter of the providence of God, that God actually brings to pass all that happen. Okay? Yet in bringing to pass all that happened, He doesn't bring it all to pass in the same way. There are those things that God will bring to pass by His direct efficiency. Meaning, He expends His energies directly to bring that to pass. Other events He brings to pass, but He brings them to pass through the independent action of His volitional creatures. So that when those things happen, those creatures are in fact making those decisions independently. Yet once they've made those decisions end up fulfilling exactly what God wanted. Yeah. So in that sense, you see, God is still separated from the act of evil itself. Yeah, but we'll discuss that at a later stage. And so we cannot accuse God of being the author of evil. Okay. Now, the second objection that is often raised to the matter of the sovereignty of God is that it takes away the liberty, the freedom of mankind. If God is sovereign, then man cannot be free, right? So the sovereignty of God is held over against the freedom of man. And those two cannot be held and sustained together. Now, the way we respond to that objection is fundamentally this way. First of all, whatever we refer to as freedom, what we call freedom, has to be clearly defined. Now, remember, we described the freedom of God. Remember when we were talking about the sovereignty of God? Yeah. But God is free, absolutely free to do what He pleases, when He pleases, however He pleases, with whomever He pleases. There are no restraints whatsoever. And He bears no accountability whatsoever. Now, God is free in the absolute sense, right? Why is He free in the absolute sense? Please, someone give me an answer that also uses the word absolute. Because He is the absolute being. Independent of everyone and everything. Complete and sufficient in and of Himself. That guarantees His absolute freedom. Okay? Now, is man self-sufficient in the way that God is? No. Man is a dependent being. Is man an absolute being? No. Man is not an absolute being. It follows, therefore, as a matter of course, that God is absolutely free because He's the absolute being. To the extent that man is not an absolute being, man cannot be absolutely free. The lack of freedom of man is necessary to him by virtue of who he is. Just like the absolute freedom of God is necessary to God. So I'm saying all of this to make this philosophical assertion that by the mere fact that man is what he is, any idea of freedom that seeks absoluteness is false and impossible, okay? Man's freedom will always be with limit because he is a limited creature. He is a limited being. Now, that alone clarifies a lot. And it clarifies a lot in that the freedom of man is granted freedom. God's freedom is intrinsic to him. Man's freedom is granted freedom. And whoever grants freedoms also determines the parameters of that freedom. And that is to be expected. So we make this conclusion then, that man is not absolutely free should not surprise us. It shouldn't even be a matter for debate that he lacks freedom in certain areas. Because by dint of who he is, he cannot be absolutely free. The freedom of man, in other words, is exercised under God. Is subject to God. So when we say that God's sovereignty takes away man's freedom, no, man's freedom is limited by nature. Okay? Now it's very nature, okay? So it's not something that God's sovereignty takes away in that sense. No. It is our refusal to admit that God is who he is and that we are who we are that brings even question, makes even this a question in the first place. But if God is rightly perceived as he is and we perceive ourselves as we are, this is not even a question. Philosophically thinking. Our freedoms are necessarily exercised under God. So then we are then compelled to define human freedom in terms other than absolute terms. So how then do we define human freedom. Here it is. When we're defining the freedom of a human being, we define it this way. That man is a moral, volitional being. That is to say, that man has the capacity for decision making. All right? That is first. And secondly, that when man makes his decisions and choices, those choices and those actions are motivated and informed by interests and impulses that are within him. Okay? Yeah. Man makes choices based on certain interests and impulses. Now those interests and those impulses come from where? From within him. They come from within him. And so, as such, man is a volitional creature. In that sense. Now, that is assuming that it's a creature and it was made in a particular way and it will function in the manner that it was made. But now that it has been made that way, all the motivations and all the motives and the impulses that drive his decisions come from him as he has been made. Yeah, that's what we mean by freedom. So now, let's say for instance, I'm going to hold a gun to your head. And I'm going to tell you now, you must denounce this class. Say this class is bad. Okay? And I'm holding a gun. And then you denounce the class. Are you responsible for the denying of the class? You are. Actually, you are. You know why? Because the decision for you to denounce the class came from you. It was motivated by your impulses. Now, there's an impulse that motivated you. What is it? Fear. You don't want to die, is it?
Yeah.
So, it is not by holding the gun to your head that caused you to do it. Because other people have had guns held to their head to do things and they haven't done it. Is it not true? Yeah. It is your fear of dying that ultimately makes that determination. And that's what I mean. At the end of the day, when man makes certain decisions, he makes those decisions based on impulses in himself. Yeah. No other human being compels us from outside. In that sense, we are free. Get the point? Yeah. So those impulses might be fear, they might be greed, they might be whatever it is. But they are impulses from within us. Now, outside forces can only stimulate those impulses, but those impulses are already resident in us. Yeah. Okay? So, like sin. When we sin because we are driven by our own desires. But those desires may be aroused by somebody. Now, that person did not plant those desires there, they only aroused them. The desires were there before they were aroused. Yeah. So let me give you another technical definition of this. So what we talk about in terms of the freedom of man, we say that man is a free agent. His decision making is caused by factors within himself. But we don't say that man has absolute free will. No, he doesn't have absolute free will because he cannot will things that will negate the purpose of God. His freedom is under God. In that sense, yeah. But he's a free agent in that the motivations around his decisions are from within himself. So you solve these issues by clearly defining what freedom means and what freedom doesn't mean. Yeah. So when man chooses to sin, he sins because of his own motivations. Look at Eve. Okay? Yeah. In that sense, Eve exercises her freedom to sin. So this is what is meant by free agency of man. Okay? So in exercise of God's sovereignty, this freedom is in no way interfered with. And so to that extent, man is fully responsible for his actions. Yeah. So when God is exercising his sovereignty, he exercises his absolute sovereignty. And man exercising his freedom, he exercises freedom within the larger framework of God's sovereignty. And whatever motivates his actions are impulses within himself. So nobody will ever stand before God and say, oh God, I only sinned because you ordained for sin to come. No. You sinned because you loved to sin. And the sin looked attractive to you at that point in time because it brought you certain benefits. That's the reason for sin. Yeah. So you're not going to hide behind God ordained it. No. When you made that decision, listen, do you think that when Eve was eating that fruit she was taking, God had ordained the fall, therefore I will fall? No, she wasn't thinking like that. She was thinking, the tree is good for food. The motivations are her own. Now, did God ordain that Christ would be crucified? Did he ordain? Yes. That he would be betrayed? Yes. Right? Now, do you think that Judas, when he was betraying Christ, was thinking, I know God has ordained that he must be crucified, let me make it come to pass? Is he thinking like that? No. He sees 30 pieces of silver, and that is his motivation. So at that level, responsibility belongs to him. He cannot therefore appeal to God's sovereignty. No, you did it. That's what Joseph tells his brothers. When you sold me, you did it out of the evil of your heart. You were motivated, not by some knowledge of the sovereignty of God, not because there's some hand pushing you around. You did it because you saw an opportunity to make a quick shilling. And then you sold your brother to make money. That's why. God charges that. Yeah? If you broke? Of course. That's what Jesus says. It's because of the hardness of your hearts. Yeah, but then you see that text is answering a particular question. Is it Matthew 19?
Matthew 19 gives us the answer. When the Pharisees, they asked Jesus about divorce.
Yeah.
Referred them to the Old Testament.
No. You started well, but the most helpful part of that episode, you don't mention it. The question was framed like this. Is it lawful to divorce your wife for any reason? That's what it is. Because that is the practice as had been adopted by the Jews of that time. So long as you can write her a letter of divorce, any reason goes. That was the thing. And Jesus is going to correct that thing. He's going to say, no. God never intended for divorce to be part of the equation. The reason why God allowed you to write letters of divorce is because of the hardness of your heart. Now, what does it mean by the hardness of your heart? Someone no longer loves their wife, treats them badly, is even going to kill them, yet according to their custom then, he can marry other women. But for as long as this one and this wife is here, notwithstanding all the mistreatment, she can't go anywhere. So now, in order to rescue the poor women from the hardness of men's heart, God opens that door. Okay? Not because divorce is good, but because God deems that in a fallen world, in certain cases, to rescue this woman from a substandard life, let the husband release her. Because if you don't release her, then she can't marry. Yeah? So here you are, you bound this woman, and she's going nowhere. You are marrying other women you like, and then you're depriving of everything, and she's stuck here. God is a caring God. So that instruction by Moses was an act of God's grace. Right? Within a sinful world. Yeah. Opening those doors. And so then, Jesus is going to restrict then the use of that right. Yeah. So it is not for any reason. And then says only for reason of that. Okay. Yeah. But it's the hardness of the house of man that have caused not just divorce, but all sorts of people. So please, what I'm saying to you then is the whole matter of human freedom has to be defined carefully, and then we must let people know that man has no absolute free will, but man is a free agent. Yeah. When he acts, he's not under compulsion. He acts based on his own motivation. And to that extent, he's responsible for what he does.
30 minutes is over.
Yes?
30 minutes is over.
Yeah, so we must now go. Yes, Chairman.